Hi, and welcome to Honey, Should We Homeschool?
We're your hosts, Leah,
And Tom.
the proud parents of a little boy and a baby girl, and we're currently asking the question, honey, should we homeschool?
We're inviting you to join us on an exploration into education with the ultimate goal of figuring out what is right for our children.
We'll be interviewing people who currently work in the schooling system, home educators and students of both paths, as well as doing research into some of the hot topics such as socialisation, bullying, higher education and exams.
We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can find us on Instagram at Honey, Should We Homeschool.
Thanks for being here.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Honey, Should We Homeschool, the podcast where we dive into the wild, wonderful, and sometimes wobbly world of home education. Today we're interviewing Ethan, who actually did his dissertation on homeschooling, but spent most of his young years being homeschooled. So, welcome, Ethan.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Leah. It's really good to be here. And yes, my dissertation, just for context, was at a theological Christian religious college called All Nations Christian College. And yes, my it's not that my degree was specifically about homeschooling. So yeah, just for a bit of context there, that's what was going on.
Well, we'll probably talk a lot about your degree and how you got to that point a bit later on.
Of
But to
course.
get started, we were wondering if you have ever actually been to school or if you were homeschooled from the start.
So the answer to that is I have never set foot in a school classroom in my life, and I was homeschooled from the start. So the closest that I have ever been to being in a classroom setting was when I wrote exams, which was when I was 17 years old. And obviously, that's much later on in my story. So it's probably too early to mention that. But yes.
So, who chose home education? Was it you or your parents? So I assume if it's from the beginning, it was your parents that chose it. Do you know why?
Yes and yes. So it was my parents who decided to homeschool me, and obviously I can't read into their minds and know what they were actually thinking exactly, but I know the narrative that they always told me. And basically, my parents to the still are deeply religious and always have been. And so their reasons for homeschooling me were intrinsically grounded in their religious faith and in the specific interpretation that they took for their religious faith, which was Christianity. Um, but when I say Christianity, there's a very big caveat to that, because obviously Christianity is a 2,000-year-old religion. It has 2.3 billion practitioners today, and so to be more correct, I would say there are a lot of Christianities, and and my parents' Christianity was just one of them. So basically, my parents always told me that their decision to homeschool me was made on the very day that I was born. And their reason for homeschooling me, based on what they always told me, was that they wanted to protect me from what they perceived to be harmful or negative spiritual influences in the wider secular world, and what they saw as being negative and harmful in the British school system. They wanted to protect me from that, and so they believed that them homeschooling me was going to ensure that I would keep the faith as they had taught it to me, and that basically I would be receiving a Christian education as opposed to what I would be receiving if I had been going to school. So that was their reason for homeschooling me. as I always knew it. And over the course of my life, as I grew up, they would often cite as confirmation for those reasons things that they saw and perceived in other families and in the children of other families, mainly other Christian families who had chosen to send their children to school. And if they perceived in their own minds that the children of these families were not um, following the Christian faith according to how they defined the Christian faith, then they would cite that as evidence that sending your children to school was going to negatively impact the faith of your children, if your intention, of course, was to bring up your children in the Christian faith. So there was a lot of confirmation bias going on there with regard to how they assessed the family lifestyles of other Christians whom they knew.
That's really interesting. It sounds like a really strong protective mindset of belief, and obviously you as their child. I guess that could probably go both ways in some circumstances. I'm sure we'll come on to some of this, but it's quite a. I think we all try and do that for our children in some way, shape, or form. We try and make sure that they are aligned with the morals that we have and aligned with the beliefs that we have. But that's, I think, talking of confirmation bias, there is quite an insightful thought.
Absolutely, and I think that's true. Every parent, regardless of whether you're religious or non-religious or whatever belief system you hold to, every parent has a set of values and beliefs that they want to bring their children up with, and therefore the way in which they choose to bring up their children is going to be influenced by that set of beliefs that they hold, whatever it might be.
Just out of curiosity, can you remember any of the particular things that they pulled up as confirmation that school was the wrong place to be?
So, my dad actually worked in schools for a number of years. And so sometimes he would cite as examples um, children who belonged to families that he liked to label as train wreck families. Sometimes it's because the parents were divorced, um, or that the children were malnourished or obese or something negative that he saw in that family, and then it would prove to him that he and my mom were doing the right thing by keeping me out of the school system. And in my later teenage years, there were other Christian families that my parents knew, and my dad would hear some story about the children of one of those families. Usually it was something along the lines of so and so's son went out and made his girlfriend pregnant, or so and so's daughter went and got pregnant. And that was usually um, the thing that triggered that kind of confirmation bias reaction. So it was negative things that they saw in other people, whether it was people sending their kids to the school my dad worked in, or people they knew who were sending their kids to school. I mean, there were homeschooling families they knew who had issues as well, and that's a completely different trajectory. But there was a homeschool group that I went to as well, and what often happened though is that my parents disagreed with a lot of people they met, regardless of whether those people were homeschoolers or not. But I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent myself now. So.
Well, we were about to head into the what was your sort of typical weekday, monthly routine? So feel free to talk about your homeschool group.
Of course. So yes, there's my routine changed over the course of my life as I grew up. So when I was prior to being a teenager, in my preteen years, my mom would take me to a homeschool group. So my dad would be at work most days, and my mom took me to a group. We were living in Nottinghamshire, and the homeschool group that I was part of doesn't exist anymore. So I don't think there's any issue with me saying the name of the group. They were called Not Sheep. That was the word not. It was spelled capital N, capital O, capital T, capital T. It was because we lived in Nottinghamshire, so it was not short for Nottinghamshire, and then the word sheep. Um, and the idea was that children are not sheep, and therefore they should not be herded around in a classroom like sheep in a field. That was the idea. So it was called Not Sheep, or North Not Sheep Group.
I quite like
And
that.
and the group was made up of an interesting variety of people. I would say roughly half of them were from the USA, and the American homeschooling families were mostly Christian, fundamentalist, the Bible Belt Southern Baptist type of American Christianity. Like, they're usually very patriotic. America is God's chosen nation, or all that kind of idea. Um, when they were living in the States, they would vote for the Republican Party and all that kind of thing. And most of the time, they believed in this idea called young Earth creationism, um, which is the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old, that humans and dinosaurs were supernaturally created by God in the biblical Garden of Eden, and that God flooded the entire planet, and there was a literal Noah's Ark, and there was two of every kind of animal on Noah's Ark, and by that logic, there was two of every species of dinosaur on Noah's Ark as well. And these American homeschooling families had their own textbooks that were published by Christian schools in America that taught that kind of idea in place of mainstream science education. So it was called creation science. And so these families provided my parents with these textbooks that they like to use. And so my parents bought into that whole idea as well. I don't think my parents were young Earth creationists to begin with. My dad wasn't, and I know that because he told me. But they bought into that idea through the influence of their American friends in the homeschool group that I went to. And then apart from the Americans, there were several British families as well. And to be honest, I don't remember any of the British families being religious. Um, Most of them were people my parents described as tree huggers. In other words, hippies, concerned about the environment. A lot of them had a vegan or vegetarian lifestyle, and so my understanding was that they were homeschooling for anti-establishment reasons, and I know my parents were very much anti-establishment in their own way, but they didn't always agree with the anti-establishment attitudes that some of the UK families held. But my parents always said that in addition to me having a Christian education, I had an American based education, and that I followed an American curriculum. And that what that meant is I wasn't actually following a set curriculum. Like, there are these whole programs that you can subscribe to, that you can buy into, and they cost hundreds of pounds or dollars if you choose to go down that route. And you download this whole curriculum online and everything, and it has everything in it: maths, English, history, geography, biology, science, and all that kind of thing. My parents didn't do that. They kind of made their own curriculum, so it was a hodgepodge of various different books and sources that they had ordered online from various different organizations. Most of them were religious organizations, but they weren't all the same organization. So they had one organization that they got my maths books from. They had another organization that they got my English language literacy books from. Another organization that they got my science books from, and so on. And so during the first 10 years of my life, my mom took me to these homeschool groups, with this mix of American and British families. And I would say I went to these groups on average once every fortnight. And we would go to Sherwood Forest a lot of the time, living in Nottinghamshire, and the other children and I would engage in various nature-related activities, whether we were looking for insects or leaves, or building forest dens, or whatever. There was usually some sort of activity that we would participate in. But sometimes it was also very freestyle, and sometimes there was no structure at all, and sometimes we were just kids charging around in the woods. And then sometimes it was more structured, like if we were visiting a power station, or a nature house where you would go bird watching or butterfly catching or something like that. So yeah, once every fortnight we would go to this homeschool group, and we would meet up at some place that was usually nature related, unless it was history related, like a castle, for instance, and that would be the running of things. And then every other day, my mom generally did have a kind of structure to how she went about educating me. So my dad wasn't really involved in a lot of my education, because my dad worked 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And so my mom was my primary educator. But given that my parents were conservative Christians, they had this idea that my dad ultimately had to be the one in charge, because they believed in male headship. So technically, my dad was the one who was ultimately in control. But really, it was my mom who was making all of the decisions in deciding how to educate me. And so I would get up in the morning. I would have breakfast, and then I had a desk in my bedroom, and my mom would sit me down at the desk, and she would put books in front of me, and I would start with maths. I would fill out some sums and equations, and then I would move on to English, and I would fill out sentences, and then I would move on to literature, and I'd read a chapter of a book, and then there would be this other book, that a study guide to that book, and then I would go through the questions in that study guide and write out answers, a paragraph or so to each question, to explain my understanding of that book. When I was under the age of 7, she followed this program called Five in a Row, and Five in a Row, once again, Christian, was it was based on all of these out of print books, mostly American books, but sometimes they were from other countries. They were like these old classic stories, usually books that were out of print, with exquisite illustrations, and very, very well written. And they usually had some sort of unique moral to the story.
So your day was very much like, you must do X amount of time of maths, X amount of time of English, X amount of time of this.
Yeah.
Did you only get to do the outdoor group once every fortnight? Was there anything else apart from doing this very structured routine that you did?
So it wasn't specifically once every fortnight. It's just in my estimation that it kind of worked out that way. I would go to this homeschool group whenever the other mothers in the homeschool group had decided to do something. But I would say on average it was like once every fortnight. But my parents had me involved in some other activities as well. One of them was swimming, and there was horse riding. And obviously, my mom was the only one educating me, and my dad was a teaching assistant in a school a lot of the time. So my parents were not rolling in it financially. Um, but my aunt and uncle, my dad's sister and her husband, have always been they were always quite supportive of me throughout my life, throughout my childhood. And they actually assisted my parents financially with helping me go to swimming lessons and horse riding lessons. So once a week, in my earlier years, when I was under the age of 10, I went horse riding and swimming, and that was each once a week. So I would go horse riding on a Saturday morning, and I would go swimming once a week at the local leisure center as well. And that would be during the week. It would be like for an hour or something on a Wednesday afternoon or something like that.
You have just described like the ideal Robin Hood situation, right? The only one you need to throw in there is archery. There's Sherwood Forest, there's the swimming, there's the horseback riding.
Well,
Like,
yeah,
it,
that's funny. Yes, I mean, Robin Hood is kind of he's an important legendary figure in Nottinghamshire, and there's a lot of places in Nottinghamshire that are named after him and used as a symbol. Funny enough, my dad always said that he didn't like the character of Robin Hood because he saw Robin Hood as um, an anti-establishment figure himself, being a thief and all. And my dad didn't like that because, yeah,
yeah,
I
that
think
that's
I think my dad saw Robin Hood as being a little bit too left wing. Basically, is what I'm trying to say.
No, it's an interesting technique actually. It's a lot of people do try and categorize and pigeonhole people, and it helps them try and understand it as well, understand the character. What I was
Yeah,
going to ask actually, given some of the things that you've talked about, just before you move on to the next part,
of
is
course.
um, the style of learning you had. You talked about the 5 in a row. I guess I'm curious, did that style of learning work really well for you in terms of like investing in the stories and
At a certain stage, it did, and obviously, in my prior conversation with Leah, I've said that I have an overall negative slant on my homeschooling experience. But if I was only talking about the first half of my childhood, um, there wouldn't be too many bad things for me to say. I have to admit there were many good things about my education when I was between the ages of 5 and 10, I would say. Um, it did give me the opportunity to dive deep into stories and literature, and I still love books and literature to this day. I don't always have a lot of time to read them, but I'm still a big fan of books and literature. I mean, my second son's middle name is Tolstoy, because I'm actually a big fan of the Russian author Leo Tolstoy. So obviously, all of those books that I had to read and study as part of my homeschooling in my early years, it must have left some sort of impression on me and had some sort of impact in making me who I am today. So yes, there were a lot of benefits there. Obviously, the whole anti-science thing and young Earth creationism, that was definitely one of the negatives. And there wasn't a lot of science going on in my early years, apart from things that I would do at homeschool group, like when I was going to a power station to see how coal was mined and what have you. But I always loved history. You know, if the homeschool group was going to a castle that week, then I would absolutely be in my element. And I think those early years gave me a lot of freedom to explore and figure out what I liked and what I had passions for.
So when did it start getting more negative for you?
Was in my teenage years. Um, because over time my parents drifted away from the people they knew in the homeschool groups. Most of the American Christian families went back to America to live there permanently, and without because my parents were Christians themselves and also quite fundamentalist as Christians, without those American Christian families to sort of anchor them in the homeschool groups, they ran out of things in common with the more secular UK based homeschooling families, and they had my mom kind of lost interest in socializing with them basically, and so my mom eventually just her taking me out of her taking me to the homeschool groups, it just kind of fizzled out. You know, one missed homeschool group outing became several, and then before long, I wasn't going at all. And that was probably around the time I was, say, 11, 12. I remember seeing one of my homeschool friends like once or twice after that, but then from that point on, it didn't happen anymore. And then the other side of that was my parents going to church. When I was around the age of 11, they stopped going to church altogether, even though they continued to be Christians and continued to be very conservative fundamentalists. They stopped going to church because there was a big scandal in their church, where the pastor of their church lost his job, because it turned out that he was a closeted gay man, and aside from the fact that Christianity often has very homophobic attitudes, he was also married and had 3 children, which also made it an extramarital affair. So, and because this pastor was someone they trusted deeply and considered a very close friend, this revelation was a massive shock to them, and it made them unable to trust anyone again. And so then they just didn't want to go to church at all. So my parents weren't taking me to church, and my mom wasn't taking me to homeschool group. So I wasn't socializing with anybody at all.
Were you still doing your swimming and your horse riding?
So around that time as well, I kind of stopped doing swimming and horse riding, but then I ended up taking music lessons, guitar playing. So yes, my parents ended up falling out of the riding school that I was going to. I can't remember exactly, but basically the horse riding instructor changed her teaching style, and my parents didn't like that, so they took me out of the riding school. And then with my swimming, um, I randomly got shingles this one time, and so my mom took me to the doctor, and the doctor told my mom that shingles can be caused by stress. And my mom concluded that it must have been the swimming that was causing me stress, because the leisure center, the swimming lessons at the leisure center that I was going to were becoming somewhat competitive, and so my mom felt that it was the competitiveness of those swimming lessons that were stressing me out and had given me shingles. So they took me out of the swimming as well. But then my dad decided that I should learn to play a musical instrument, and because he had randomly bought me a guitar some years before, he decided that it would be right for me to take guitar lessons. And so between the ages of 12 and 18, basically, I was actually having weekly guitar lessons that eventually became every 2 weeks. And once again, it was actually my aunt and uncle paying for those guitar lessons. Um,
But that was the only social interaction you were getting?
Essentially, yes. My dad, in addition to his work in the school, he ended up kind of changing jobs from being a TA to being an after school club supervisor when I was around the age of 13. Um, and then he got this job at a Christian charity shop that sold books and distributed these books in Africa for as part of like a literature mission. And so my dad started working in this bookshop. And then during the summer holidays, when he wasn't doing his work in the school, my mom would let me go to work with him. And so I would kind of just spend the whole summer holiday hanging out with my dad at this Christian charity bookshop. And most of the time, my dad was packing books in the warehouse. He wasn't the manager of the store. He was assisting the manager by packing the boxes that were being sent to Africa. And so I would go there during the holidays and help my dad pack these boxes. And then when somebody came into the shop to buy books, usually it was the pastor of some church, or it was just a regular. There were a few regular customers of this bookshop who would come in to buy um, Christian books that were of a specific theological genre that they were into. You know, books that had a certain spiritual message that they liked. And oftentimes I would chat to these customers. Like these customers were often old people, people in their 40s, 50s and older. And I was a teenager, 13, 14, 15, and I would often talk to them about random theological topics that I found interesting. Usually it was related to the whole creation science thing that I was taught, like, young earth creationism and all of that. Um, and that's basically because I wasn't seeing anyone at that point. I had no other friends, and I wasn't going anywhere, and so I had no other interests apart from maybe reading books about history. I was fascinated with ancient Rome, so um, yes, I ended up having these really bizarre, really unusual conversations with adults who were much, much older than me about really obscure topics that fundamentalist Christians care about. So, in addition to my guitar lessons, that was really the only other social interactions that I had. Although, one other thing, my parents joined a sailing club when I was about 14. My parents decided to get me a sailing dinghy, a topper. Yeah, it was about, I don't know, 6 feet long and made of fiberglass. And so my parents joined this sailing club, and they took me to this club, and I more or less learnt to sail a boat on the small lake. And there was this thing that they sent me to that was run by the local sea cadets, that involved getting your level 2 RNLI um, life skills on water certificate thing. And so I did that one time. Um, and I'm not sure how much of it I took in or how much I really learned from it. I often found sailing kind of boring and frustrating. But again, I didn't join the Sea Cadets because, well, given my social circumstances, where I wasn't regularly seeing other young people my own age, I wasn't very good at socializing. Um, especially with people my own age, I found it easier to talk to old people than I did to other young people and children. So I didn't gel very well with the other sea cadets, and my parents didn't see the need to push me with it. So they decided, okay, they won't have me join the sea cadets. So I would just go to the sailing club with my parents some weekends and sail this boat. So yes, I think during my mid teenage years, so between the ages of 17 and and 12, my three main weekly social experiences were guitar playing, where I would socialize with my guitar teacher, the odd day that I went with my dad to the bookshop, and the odd weekend that we went to the sailing club. I would sort of socialize with the other people at the club, who were all adults, because the sea cadets weren't always there and I wasn't really part of them.
How did that make you feel as a teenager?
I mean, it was it took me a long time to realize that I wasn't happy with it. I mean, obviously I wasn't happy about it, but it took me a long time to realize that I wasn't happy. Um, and the problem was, uh, most of the time I didn't really want to leave the house because I wasn't being socialized enough to have an incentive to leave the house, because I there wasn't really anything out there for me that I was involved in, so I never wanted to leave the home. So um, guitar playing and sailing just became these things that I did mainly to please my parents, and I didn't. I eventually realized that I didn't enjoy any of it at all, because with both of them, the novelty just wore off. It was fun and exciting to begin with, but then after a while, it just became repetitive, and I lost interest in it. But I didn't ever want to tell my parents that I wasn't enjoying it or that I didn't like it, because I didn't want to disappoint them. And I knew that both of those things were like really important to my dad. Um, but if I were to have had it my way 24/7, I would have just wanted to stay inside reading books about ancient history and theology, because that's what I was really interested in. And sometimes I went to the local library when we were living in Worksop. I went to the local library and I would take up books, and so that's what I liked to do most of the time, was just stay inside and read a book. I was a very bookish person, and I wasn't good at socializing with people, and therefore I most of the time didn't really want to go out and talk to anyone.
Do you think if you'd had more of an opportunity to socialize on a regular basis, you would have been a more social person?
I believe so. I think so. It's obviously I can't prove that, and I can look back now and say I would have done this or that if things had been different. So I don't know anything for sure, but I reckon if I had been socialized more, I would have had more of an incentive to come out of my shell. And to give you one example, is with the music playing. Basically, when I was 18, I decided that I wanted to start socializing with people and mixing with society a bit more. And so I told my parents that I wanted to start going to church. And I started going to a local evangelical church in Worksop by myself, without my parents. I was 18 by that point. And I started to sort of make friends with some of the people in that church, and there was a group of young people, like young adults, between the ages of 16 and 20, I would say, who were active in that church and were quite musical, most of them, and they formed like a Christian worship band in that church. And because I was still having guitar lessons at that point, I wanted to join the worship band, and thought that I could play with them. The problem with my guitar lessons is that there wasn't up until that point, there hadn't been a lot to inspire me. So I would meet with the music tutor. He would give me a sheet of music to play. He would say, "This is how you play it." I would play it, but then I didn't really know what else to do with it after that. And sometimes my dad would bring home these music books from the Christian bookshop and say, "Here's a music book. Can you play it?" And again, I didn't know how to gauge with those music books. I could be like, okay, I can see that's a chord A. I can see that's a chord G. I can play those chords, but I didn't really know what else to do with it because I didn't have anyone to play with. And so when I started mixing with some of these other young people in the church, I thought, well, here's my opportunity. The problem was I had never had any experience playing with somebody else, so I didn't know how to play in sync with them. I had no practice or experience with that because I'd only ever played by myself, and there wasn't really anyone there who was able to teach me or help me improve. And theoretically, there shouldn't have needed to be because I'd already been having guitar lessons for the past 8 years or something. So I was just kind of lost in that situation because I technically had all of this head knowledge about the theory of playing a guitar, but I had no practical experience of playing in a band. And so initially, I was really enthusiastic and excited to be part of that. And I tried practicing more at home to try and get good at it. But sadly, I think a lot of it was just too little too late because there was no way I was going to in that small space of time, there was no way I was going to be able to catch up with the others and keep up with them. And so I then just became discouraged and felt that there was really no point in me trying. And so then I just dropped out of it. But I think had my parents not stopped going to church when I was um, 11 years old, if they had instead decided to stay in their church or find a different church, at least a church that was, semi vibrant and had young people and a music band and all that kind of thing, I could have got into it. If I had started much earlier on when I was, say, 12 or 13. But by the time I was already 17, 18, it was just too late, and there was not enough time for me to get into it. And well, that's my personal feeling about it. Obviously, it's purely subjective, and I can't prove that, but that's how I personally feel about it.
It's a fairly logical way of thinking about it, right? Like if you, we talk a lot about the theory behind something and the ability to put it into practice, and sometimes doing something in practice can teach you more than 1,000 books on the subject can, and that's one of them, right? Being in time with other people, understanding cues, understanding the kind of even social aspects of playing in a band. Were there any other things that it really impacted? So, because it sounds to me, and it's only what I'm hearing, so apologies if I've heard this wrong, but there was quite a lot of maybe fear governed what you did and didn't do during your teenage years, not necessarily from your perspective, but from your parents not wanting you to be involved with the wrong people or being taken down a certain path. And that, I mean, the way you've described it yourself, it sounds very isolating. And you've talked about the music side of it, but were there any other things that you think actually, that was really detrimental?
Well, in terms of fear on the part of my parents, I would absolutely say yes. There was a lot of fear. They were afraid of me being negatively influenced by other people I was socializing with, and right. Already there is an example in that particular church that I was attending. And as I said, I was 18 by this point. But after about 9 months or so of me attending that church, my parents actually pressured me into leaving the church because they became curious about this church I was attending, and they started attending a few of the services themselves. And then after a little while, they decided that they didn't like the church and they wanted me to leave. And the reason why, well, one of the reasons why is because they noticed a teenage girl in that church who was wearing low cut shorts and a tank top, and they interpreted that as being sexually provocative, and therefore they didn't want me being negatively influenced by that. And then there was somebody in that church. He was, volunteering with the sound system on a Sunday morning. And when my parents found out that the guy had a girlfriend that he lived with, they also balked at that, because they in their minds that was living in sin, and therefore they said that someone who's living in sin shouldn't be allowed to have a volunteer role in the church. So they used that to label the church as evil. Actually, my dad used the word debauched, and and they basically made me stop going. And as I said, I was 18, but I hadn't started going to Bible college at that point, so I was still 100% under their control and influence. But there was always, even before I was 18, all throughout my childhood, there was always that strong sense of fear that I was going to be negatively influenced by other people. And I think part of the reason why my mom wanted to stop going to the homeschool group was because after the American Christians left, there were no more religious families in the homeschool group, and therefore there was that fear that I was going to be negatively influenced by the children and families in that group who didn't hold to my parents' beliefs.
So you mentioned a second ago about when you said before you went to something college. So how did you go about getting into college? Did you have to take exams?
She told my mom, because she always felt that my mom was the more reasonable out of my two parents. Um, she told my mom basically, if Ethan doesn't do exams, if he doesn't do GCSEs, if he doesn't get some sort of school leaving certificate, then he's not really going to stand much of a chance in life. And up till that point, my dad had some vague notion of me going to America, and because of course the whole religious framework that they subscribe to came from America, he had this vague notion that I was going to go to America and get some sort of accredited qualification um, via whatever system was available over there. And But my dad's sister convinced my mom that that just wasn't a practical or a realistic idea. And so then my mom ended up persuading my dad to allow her to start looking into what options were available to me with regards to doing GCSEs and sitting exams. And what ended up happening is she found this small, independent, online based Christian school that catered to homeschoolers. So, what they had was a full school curriculum from the secondary level onwards. So, for secondary school aged kids who were being homeschooled, and it was based at a small Church of England church in a village called Johnfield, which I'm not sure if it was altogether in Nottinghamshire. I think it might have been more Derbyshire or something like that. I'll have to check on a map. I could be totally wrong here. But basically, my mom found this online school that provided um, Cambridge exams that were accredited by Cambridge, that were part of these international GCSE programs. So when I say international, I mean international. There were students in India, for instance, who were sitting these exact same Cambridge accredited exams. And these were not GCSEs per se, they were IGCSEs. So when I was 16, I started preparing for my GCSEs. And up till that point, I had literally just been seated at home in my bedroom, all by myself at home, because my mom got a job when I was 13. I'm sorry, I failed to mention that. My mom got a job when I was 13, and she ended up working full time, and my dad was working full time. So when I was between the ages of 13 and 16, I wasn't really doing anything structured education wise. I had a few American textbooks that taught weird ideas, and I would just sit at home reading these textbooks, but I wasn't very good at structuring myself. I wasn't very good at disciplining myself, and therefore I wasn't very good at educating myself. And then my parents had a kind of meltdown moment one day when they realized that I hadn't been learning anything at all, and I was kind of in big trouble because of that, because I didn't know how to educate myself and hadn't been doing very well at that, and that might have also influenced their decision to find me some structured framework for me to follow. And so when I was 16, I got enrolled with this independent homeschooling Christian school, and started preparing for IGCSEs. And I took my IGCSE exams at the school, which was based at the church, and the exams were invigilated and everything. And there were other homeschooling families from all over the country who had come to be there at those exams. There was even a family from Scotland who had driven all the way down from uh, Edinburgh or wherever to be there at that exam. And so I did 5 international GCSEs. They were maths, English, history, biology, and English literature. So there was 2 Englishes, English language and English literature. And then I also did an O level in biblical studies, because initially I was going to do IGCSE religious studies, but then my parents didn't like the curricula that was part of the IGCSE religious studies. I was going to study Christianity and Judaism, but obviously these curricula weren't from a fundamentalist perspective like the one that they held to, and so they changed it for me, and I ended up doing O level biblical studies, which was just studying the actual texts of the Bible, and so I ended up writing exams on the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. And then after I did my IGCSEs, I did A levels. Again, it was accredited by Cambridge. So I did A level English literature, A level history, and A level divinity, which was basically just a deeper version of biblical studies.
Did any of these have any lessons in person, or was it all?
I had tutors. So I communicated with my tutors via email, and these tutors were employed by the college that was providing me with the exams and the coursework. And then going on to the college where I did my university degree, um, the way in which that happened is that shortly before COVID happened, because I finished my A levels in late 2019. I wrote my last A level exams in October 2019, and then uh, the conversation turned to what I was going to do after that, and my mom wanted me to do a mission trip in Israel, because my mom has this Jewish heritage. Oh, and I've totally forgotten to mention, I'm South African. and my parents are South African, and so my mom had a bunch of family members in South Africa who were Jewish, and so my mom wanted me to go to Israel for this missionary trip, and so my parents put me in touch with some old connections of theirs. Back when my parents were still living in South Africa, they were affiliated with a religious organization called Jews for Jesus, which was a Christian organization whose purpose was to convert Jewish people to Christianity. And so my parents had some old connections there, and they put me in contact with some of these people they knew to find out if they could support me in going to a mission trip to Israel. And then, right at that moment, COVID-19 struck, and so I ended up having a sort of gap year where I didn't go anywhere. And once again, I was just sitting at home reading books, not really doing much, except occasionally I went to church again, because around that time my parents also started attending a small Anglican church, because my dad had become friends with the vicar, because the vicar liked to buy books at the bookshop where my dad worked. So I know that's a rabbit hole all of its own. But I ended up going to All Nations Christian College because one of the people at Jews for Jesus was a lecturer at that college. Now, All Nations College is a Christian charity or institution that provides degrees in mission studies. And mission is the idea of going to a foreign country to proselytize your faith. And so this college is or was accredited by the Open University. For those who don't know what the Open University is, it's an international university that provides accredited degrees of all shapes and sizes, of all categories. BSs, BAs, BEngs, or what have you. And usually, the Open University is used by people in their midlife who don't have a degree and want to restart their career and get an education in something. But All Nations was using the Open University to accredit the qualifications that they were providing. But anyhow, I went there, I did a campus based degree, and I graduated last year. Well, technically, I graduated at the beginning of this year, but I finished my actual degree course in June of last year, and so I now have an Open University degree in biblical and intercultural studies, um, and just as a sort of side note, I'm not entirely sure what the benefit of my degree is to me right now. Currently, uh, I work at a local convenience store, and I'm a sales assistant, and I got that job via the job center. I could have got that job without going to All Nations Christian College. I didn't need to get that Open University degree in order to get my current job as a sales assistant. And most of the jobs that I've applied for, actually all of the jobs that I've applied for since moving down to Cornwall, have always said that what they're looking for is experience, and don't really care too much about whether or not you have a university degree.
If it makes you feel any better, I think me and Tom both have degrees that are actually quite useless, or have been quite useless to
Degrees,
us.
yes.
When I spoke to you previously, just to go sort of back in time a little bit, we spoke briefly about the authorities and local authorities and how they were involved, because in most counties, the local authority will come and check up on you if you're homeschooling to see how you're doing and everything like that. So did they never come around and say, like, maybe he could socialize a bit more?
Yes, so my parents did register me with the local authority. I think my mom did have a sense that she wanted to be accountable to someone, And at the very least, she wanted to prove that she was doing a good job. So they didn't want to feel as though they were doing anything on the quiet, or that they were, that they were part of some sort of underground network or whatever. My mom wanted to keep it out in the open, um, but of course, when they did speak to the local authority representative, they were definitely spinning the narrative, in order to present themselves and their style of educating me, in the most positive light possible. So from the time that I was like 7, um, there was this annual inspector who would come to our house, and she would chat to me and my mom. She never chatted to me privately. She only chatted to my mom with me next to my mom, and was basically just like, okay, tell me about the past year, tell me about what you've learned, tell me about what you've done, tell me about what you've achieved. And obviously, I would do some of the talking. Usually, I would tell the lady about whatever it was I was most into at that time, um, whatever topic I was fascinated with. Say if it was ancient Rome, for instance, and so my comments about that would be placed into the inspector's report once she had written it. But obviously, my mom would do most of the talking, and would have all of my textbooks out and all of the work that I had done to show the inspector and say, this is what Ethan's done, this is what Ethan's achieved. And then about 4 or 5 weeks later, the inspector would send my parents a report, um, about my homeschooling and about what I had achieved. And these reports were always very glowing, and usually didn't really come with any recommendations, because either the inspector was truly impressed with what I'd been learning, or my parents were very good at spinning the narrative to make it sound really good. Um, but anyhow, when I was 15, the lady who had always been my visitor, she moved to a different job or something, and so we ended up having a different visitor, a gentleman this time. And after his first visit, his report was still positive, like it wasn't a negative report, but he'd evidently noticed that there was something lacking in my education. And the main thing that concerned him was whether or not I was going to do GCSEs. And so in his report that year, he had stated as a recommendation that I start preparing for GCSEs. And that might have also had an influence in making my mom more willing to listen to my dad's sister, when talking about the fact that I needed to do GCSEs. So, yes, to clarify, I was registered with the local authority, and I had annual visits from a local authority visitor, but nothing was ever just between me and the visitor, and my parents were largely in control of the conversation that took place when the visitor was there.
Do you think if you had had the opportunity to sit and talk to the visitor one on one, you might have said other things? You might have brought up the fact that you might want to socialize more or anything like that?
I probably, I doubt that I would have intentionally slated my parents or my homeschooling, because I didn't actually start thinking critically about my homeschooling until I started going to All Nations College and doing my degree. So up until I left home, I had always been 100% on the side of my parents and on the side of every decision that they had ever made, because I had no other frame of reference and no one else to talk to about it. And anyone who might have had a negative view on my education, my parents heavily restricted and limited the amount of contact that I had with any of those people, such as my aunt, for instance. But it's possible that if I'd had any one-to-one conversations with the visitor, and if the visitor had actually asked me direct and leading questions, it's likely that I might have given things away, that I might have allowed things to slip in my answers, because I think I've always been a naturally honest person in the sense that I'm not a good liar, and you know, I'm I show my hand very easily, and that certainly was the case when I was a child. And so I'm pretty sure if the inspector had asked me leading questions away from my parents, I probably would have um, let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, and unintentionally allowed negative sides of my education to slip out. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
It does. Do you think so? You've talked a lot about the challenges that you experienced in the second half of your education, and as we've mentioned, the lack of socialization. I'm curious about a couple of things. It sounded like the first half, and we've talked about this, was pretty good. Are there any positives that you took out of the second half, or is it mostly sort of the challenges that you've held on to and sort of, I guess, been maybe a bit frustrated by?
I mean, um, I would say that um, I read some books during that time that were good, that I enjoyed reading. Um, I suppose I had a lot of time to I had a lot of freedom to some extent to explore various ideas. But the problem is that okay, a lot of those things weren't bad in and of themselves, like the books I read. But because it was so because it was that and nothing else, the impact on my social skills was largely for the worse. So the thing is, it's um, like the saying. I don't know if it is a saying, but like too much of a good thing is actually a bad thing, and it's like yes, spending time reading novels. I mean, I never had an Xbox or a PlayStation or anything like that. So it was a positive thing that I was able to um, be studious enough to read a 500-page novel. And I was capable of doing that at the age of 14. And I suppose I did benefit a lot from reading those books. But the problem is that's the only thing I was ever doing with my free time, and just spending my whole life reading a novel. It didn't adequately prepare me for interacting with normal people in the outside everyday social environments. So yes, there were some positive experiences and positive, uh, yeah, positive experiences, enjoyable memories, so to speak, um, from my teenage years. But because it was that and nothing else, I would say that it wasn't only a good thing, but it was actually in most of the time so much of a good thing, that too much of a good thing, that it was actually it became a negative rather than a positive. So I'm sorry if that's probably quite a convoluted answer, but I don't really know how else to make that make sense. Do you know what I mean?
No, that's good. That's really good. I think the reason that I was interested is it sounded like you got a bit of um, punishment's probably not the right word, but you got in hot water for not doing enough education at points in your secondary education time, as we kind of pigeonhole it in the UK. And I think if I'd been left to my own devices, I probably just would have been really good at FIFA, like in my teenage years. I don't think I would have,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have known how to educate myself.
Yes. Yes. So like I totally understand that. Funny enough, I didn't. I never got into playing computer games or video games, and that's not because I wasn't allowed to. I actually did play a few. I played Age of Empires. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's an online role playing
Love
game.
that game.
And I spent a few weekends doing that. But eventually, I just lost interest in playing computer games because I would complete a level and then there would just be another level to complete. And when I got started getting to the higher levels of the game, I started finding it too difficult, and it would be frustrating every time my village got destroyed or something. I had to then go back to the beginning and start all over again. So I eventually just found computer games too tedious, and I stopped playing them. And then I
That's
just went
fair.
back to reading my books.
You have a follow-up to the question, Tom?
I guess one of the questions I had was you talked about the challenges you had socially with people because of the relative isolation you had in your teenage years. When you were able to start socializing with people that were similar age to you at college level, university level, did that quickly speed up and quickly improve, or did you struggle with that initially?
I struggled with it 100%. I think to begin with, what I wanted to do was just like take the lid off my brain and kind of turn it upside down like a bin and shake it out and empty it everywhere. Because I was in this new social environment that I had never really been in before in my life, and there were all these new people around me for me to talk to, and I had this one thing in common, which was the religious faith aspect, and I had my whole uh, homeschooling background that was all built upon that religious faith, and so all I wanted to do the whole time when I started meeting all of these new people at college was um, showing them all the knowledge and information that I had inside my head to kind of try and bounce it off them, because I wanted to see how much of it was true and how much of it was just from my parents. And I think, well, to a certain extent, I wanted to prove to myself that it was true. I wanted to validate for myself that everything that my parents had told me and taught me was true and was rock solid. And so um, because by that point I was already beginning to ask myself questions about my homeschooling, but I hadn't become full on critical of it. I wasn't at that stage yet, but I had some nagging doubts and questions, and I wanted to prove to myself that all of it was true and good and right, and I did that by wanting to bounce it off all of the people that I was talking to at college. And what struck me very quickly was that most of the people at my college, particularly the ones who were of my age group, had all gone to school, and none of them had been homeschooled, and yet they had still been brought up in religious homes, and they still held to that religious faith themselves, even though they had gone to school. And so that was a that was a particularly pertinent realization for me, was realizing that theoretically my parents could have sent me to school, and there's a good chance that I would have kept my faith. And because my homeschooling was all built upon that whole faith idea, um, that was the moment when I really started to become uh, started to think critically about my homeschooled upbringing. And then the other side of that is that I actually found it really hard to socialize with people when I wasn't talking about theology, you know, or faith or history or any of the topics that I had been obsessed with when I was growing up. So I couldn't just have a casual conversation with people about, say, football. And to this very day, I still find it difficult to have conversations like that, because, for instance, neither of my parents were particularly sporty people. They didn't like football, and so when I was just having normal everyday conversations with people at my college, even though it was a Christian college, I I realized that I didn't know how to hold a normal conversation if it wasn't about one of the specific topics that I had grown up being taught and having my homeschooling centered around. And so that was another watershed moment for me when I began to think, hang on a second, maybe there is something wrong with my homeschooling. And then after a while, I began to think critically about the friendships and relationships that I had with people in this college. And I began to think, it began to dawn on me, as a sort of nagging suspicion that a lot of these people were were just being nice to me, basically, and they wouldn't, if they were just normal casual people in society outside of that, no close knit niche Bible college environment. If we weren't in that Bible college environment, these people I was socializing with likely wouldn't want to be close friends of me, and that they were being nice to me and they were tolerating me in that specific environment, because I was a fellow member of their faith, and I was studying in this small college with them, which had at most 100 to 120 students. So yeah, it I began to realize through these various discoveries that if I was just on my own in society, I just wouldn't know how to function, and I just wouldn't know how to interact, because the only thing that I was knowledgeable about and experienced with and able to communicate with people over, was the uh, niche and insular topics that were prominent in my homeschooled education. Um, I hope that's helpful in answering your question.
Now, it's really interesting. Thank you very much for that answer. It's a challenge for quite a lot of people, I think, is socialization, and the not just homeschool children, but children at school as well. People that a lot of people don't necessarily like doing it that much. But if you've never had the opportunity or you weren't given much opportunity as a teenager, that must have been really challenging. I know there's some things that a friend of mine recently has been talking to me about how do you make conversation with anybody, and the idea, one of the ridiculous ideas he had was, I think he read this somewhere. It's not ridiculous actually; it works quite well. Is during most sentences, during most conversations you have with somebody, they'll mention either a person, a place, or a thing, and then you can ask a question about either the person, the place, or a thing in the past, the present, or the future, and how it impacted them. And I found it quite an interesting way of being like, okay, I don't necessarily have a lot in common with this person, yet people do tend to like talking about things they're interested in. If they've mentioned something, you can pick up on that and kind of run with it. And I found that quite fascinating. Anyway, total tangent. The other bit that I found quite interesting is it sounds like it had a real impact on your own confidence more than anything. Some of the things you've talked about there, believing that,
Yeah,
and through the methods that you've mentioned, the tests that you've kind of given yourself, you know that sense that people are only socializing with you because you are part of this group. That's quite hard for anybody. Like, that's quite a hard thing to deal with. Um, so yeah, thank you very much. That was very, very honest, that answer, and it was, yeah, very insightful.
Oh, thank you.
Would you, after what you've been through, consider home educating your own children?
Speaking in pure hypotheticals, um, there would have to be a very strong practical reason um, for me to make that choice. Um, Say if one of my children had some, I don't know, a special education need that no school around was able to accommodate, for instance. um, or I don't know if my child was having such an extremely negative experience in school, because obviously people do have extreme negative experiences in school. I'm not denying that that is the case. If, say, one of my children was having such an extremely negative experience in school for whatever reason, whether it's bullying or I don't know, academic pressure or whatever, that they became seriously depressed, to the point of wanting to harm themselves, for instance, um, then I would consider taking them out of school, especially if that was out of a concern for their physical safety and their very life. Um, I'm not saying that it is wrong to homeschool for any reason other than that. I'm just saying that for me personally, um, I don't think I would choose to homeschool for any reason other than either of those reasons, simply because I've had um, uh, a particularly painful experience with homeschooling in the second half of my childhood. I wouldn't know how to homeschool my children without separating that from my, you know, from my mind. I wouldn't be able to compartmentalize my own experience from the idea of homeschooling, and therefore I reckon I would find it difficult to homeschool and to make that choice, um, for that reason. But as I said, um, if there was a legitimate practical concern involved in taking my children out of school, if they had a serious educational need that the school wasn't able to accommodate, or if they were having an extremely negative experience in school that was seriously affecting their mental health, then yes, I would be willing to consider an alternative option.
It's very, very logical approach. Yeah, I thank you. So our last question is this question we asked to everybody is, do you have any advice to anybody new to home education or who is thinking about it?
So, if I were to take it upon myself to give one piece of advice, I would say, basically, I would say, look, we all ultimately want the same thing for our children. What we all want is for our children to grow up, to become functional adults and fully fleshed out people, who are able to function in society as best they can and to live out their dreams and reach their full potential, in whatever it is that they want to achieve. And so ultimately, whatever choice you make, with how to bring up your children, um, your goal is to bring them to that point. And so, um, my advice would be um, to always remind yourself that that is your end goal, and therefore, when you're making a decision about your child's education, I would suggest that you ask yourself: is this going to bring my child to that point? For instance, if my child wants to become a doctor or a lawyer, um, will the education I'm giving them right now enable them to achieve that? If my child decides one day that they actually want to do something really practical, like being a gardener or a plumber, then will the education that I'm giving them right now help them reach that stage? And obviously, I think the main negative aspect of my own personal experience with homeschooling was the lack of socialization. And obviously you want your child to have social experiences that are positive and good for them. I'm not saying that a parent should just throw caution to the wind and say, actually, I don't care who my child socializes with. I don't care if they socialize with friends who want to offer them drugs and the like. But a parent who's homeschooling, I think, should endeavor to do whatever they can to make sure that their child is socializing in a healthy way with people with whom they can form relationships that are going to be healthy uh, and meaningful in building positive relationships with other people. And the end goal of those relationships and social experiences should be to help them function and interact with society as fully functional and independent adults when by the time they reach the age of 18, basically. Um, so, hopefully that actually sounds like a piece of advice. And if it is, that's the piece of advice that I would give.
I think that sounds like good advice.
Yeah, that's that's great. Thank you very much, and thank you for being so open with us today. It's important to recognise that there are any number of circumstances that could lead to somebody being in a challenging environment where they can be isolated from peers and not able to have these socialization opportunities. But it takes a lot to talk honestly about the hard stuff. Hearing you describe some of the teenage years as painful and something you wouldn't necessarily want to repeat really brings that home. So on Honey Should We Homeschool, we don't always want to cover the success stories. It's easy to paint homeschooling as a really good alternative for school, but it's hard work. The reality is much more complex, and people are more complex in how they operate. Sometimes especially in Ethan's situation, it can be lonely, it can be quite hard, and sometimes it doesn't quite work in the way that you hoped. So that's exactly why this conversation is really important for parents who are thinking about the idea of homeschooling or potentially pulling their kids out of school at teen years, or people who've lived through it and are still kind of unpacking what that meant for them. I hope this episode has been really useful. So, again, Ethan, I really want to thank you for sharing your experience so openly with us today.
And yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Leah. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been really beneficial to me too, and I hope it has been just as beneficial to you.
It has, and that's great to hear from our perspective. Um, if you've got any questions for Ethan or for ourselves, please fire them into our email address or our Instagram account or our Facebook account. Any of those we can respond on. If you respond to send us a text on Spotify, we can't respond to that one. We will answer it on the show, but we can't respond to that. But that's it from us today on Honey Should We Homeschool. Thank you very much for tuning in. We love you guys as always, and we will see you next time.
Bye.